This morning's reading is from 2 Samuel 12, reading verses 1 to 15. The Lord's message for David. The Lord was angry at what David had done and sent Nathan the prophet to tell this story to David. A rich man and a poor man lived in the same town. The rich man owned a lot of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had only one little lamb that he had bought and raised. The lamb became a pet for him and his children. He even let it eat from his plate and drink from his cup and sleep on his lap. The lamb was like one of his own children. One day, someone came to visit the rich man, but the rich man didn't want to kill any of his own sheep or cattle and serve it to the visitor. So he stole the poor man's little lamb and served it instead. David was furious with the rich man and said to Nathan, "I swear by the living Lord that the man who did this deserves to die. And because he didn't have any pity on the poor man, he'll have to pay 4 times what the lamb was worth." Then Nathan told David, "You are that rich man. Now listen to what the Lord God of Israel says to you. I chose you to be the king of Israel. I kept you safe from Saul, and I even gave you a house and his wives. I let you rule Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, I would have given you much more. Why did you disobey me and do such horrible thing? You murdered Uriah the Hittite by having the Ammonites kill him so you could take his wife. Because you wouldn't obey me and took Uriah's wife for yourself, your family will never live in peace. Someone from your own family will cause you a lot of trouble, and I'll take your wives and give them to another man before your very eyes. He'll go to bed with them while everyone looks on. What you did was in secret, but I'll do this in the open for everyone in Israel to see." David said, "I have disobeyed the Lord." "Yes, you have," Nathan answered. "You showed you don't care what the Lord wanted. He has forgiven you and you won't die, but your newborn son will." Then Nathan went back home. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you.
Facing the truth. Sometimes life confronts us with some painful truths. Our bank may tell us there are no funds in our account. We may finally hear what people have been saying to us for years, and we struggle to take it on board. The police may come to our door to report that our son has been killed in a tragic accident. Our doctor may confirm that our illness is terminal. And on that slide, the previous one, better to get hurt by the truth than be comforted with a lie, is quite a profound statement. King David was a warrior, but one particular spring, he did not go out to battle with the army. He put Joab in charge of his soldiers. And back in Jerusalem, he saw a beautiful woman, Bathsheba. And as king, he had the power and he sent for her. After her visit, she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." That was a painful truth for him because her husband Uriah was away fighting with the army of Israel against the Ammonites. And David tried many ways to cover up the truth that he was responsible for the pregnancy by calling Uriah home from the battlefield. But Uriah would not go home to Bathsheba while his fellow soldiers were fighting. And finally, David decided to remove Uriah from the scene altogether. He arranged with Joab for Uriah to be in the front line and to be vulnerable so that he would be killed. And David's plan with Joab worked. After Bathsheba completed her period of mourning in the death of her husband, David sent for her to become his wife. And the Bible tells us, in I think very measured terms, the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And so the Lord sent the prophet Nathan to David. He told David a story of two men, and we've just heard it from Alexander, a rich man and the poor man, the former with very many flocks and herds, and the latter with one lamb that grew up as part of the family. A traveller arrived at the rich man's house, and he needed to offer hospitality. That was the culture. He didn't want to take one of his own flock or herds, so he took the poor man's lamb. And David was so angry that he said to Nathan, just as he heard a story, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die." And Nathan confronted David with the painful truth: you are that man. You had all you needed. You had Uriah struck down, and you have taken his wife. David owned up to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." He faced the truth. And Nathan revealed God's grace. "The Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. You deserve to die. But the child that is born to you will die." David faced the truth of his actions. 2 years ago at this service, of course all of you remember, I told how my great-grandfather, Joseph Griffith Sims, used guns to scare Aborigines and protect his property. Sims joined the British Army in 1840, and that's the flag of the regiment that he joined, and that's a photo of NCOs in his regiment, so that's the dress that he wore because he was a sergeant. Sims ended up fighting in the land wars in New Zealand against Maoris opposed to the outworking of the Treaty of Waitangi. And in 1845, in a battle, he was shot in the knee. It was a one-sided battle where something like 20 soldiers were killed in about, out of a force of about 100, were killed in about 5 or 10 minutes. The British had no hope of overcoming this magnificent Maori fortress that was there. He was discharged from the army in 1847 and migrated to South Australia the next year. I told the story of him being in the Flinders Ranges. He was a pioneer grazing sheep in the isolation of what was called the North in those days. And a severe drought saw him and his young family move to Queensland, where he was a pioneer in the malting industry. And as I knew that bit of the story, I kind of admired him as an adventurous and entrepreneurial spirit. Well, last May, I think it was, we visited and enjoyed Norfolk Island. That's an aerial view of Kingston, which is the convict settlement. That's the remains of the convict settlement at Norfolk Island. And while there, I discovered in one of the museum tours that the same great-grandfather, his regiment was in charge of the convict settlement there between 1844 and 1846. Now, we'd already heard that the worst of the Australian convicts spent time at Norfolk Island, and that they received brutal treatment from the soldiers. But I had been thinking about Sims as a respectable British soldier. But now the realisation was dawning on me. He probably dealt out harsh treatment to the convicts. Maybe my colour sergeant great-grandfather represented the abuses of the British colonial power. And consistent with that unpalatable potential truth about my grandfather is this family heirloom that I brought with me. It looks like a harmless walking stick with a bit of, I don't know, antler, I think, or horn, or it could be ivory. But it's not as harmless as it appears. And I wondered about whether I should even share that today, simply because I don't want to glorify any sort of violence. I'm facing the possible truth about my great-grandfather that he wasn't as gracious and kind, or at least he participated in the culture of the British soldiers in those days. Today we've been confronted again with the horrors of the Murdering Creek massacre. We've all seen that sign. Apparently the indigenous people saw cattle on their land as fair game, whereas the white people felt they were not entitled to help themselves. A clash of cultures, a lack of understanding. And they decided they had to stop the Aboriginal people killing their cattle, and so they planned a way to slaughter them. And our generation received a sanitised version of British colonial history. And so we were taught in school about deliberate killing of Aborigines. We were never taught in school about deliberate killing of Aborigines through poisoning their food and through planned massacres. And as I said earlier, the University of Newcastle has an ongoing project entitled Colonial Frontier Massacres in Australia 1788 to 1930. And they have produced this map. It's a work in progress. They are still developing the map and adding sites as they discover them, or as they discover them through research. This site, at the moment, this map shows 304 massacre sites across Australia. But I thought I might just list some close to where we live. And one of the triggers, particularly I think in Queensland, was the first massacre in 1842. There may have been some before this, but this was significant. Perhaps 60 Gigaburra and Woongunburra Aborigines were massacred at Kilcoy, and that was through strychnine and the flour. And that triggered a response from the Indigenous people as well. In 1851, 1852, 100 Butchulla people from a collection of clans were killed on Fraser Island, where they were seeking refuge. In 1854, 6 Gubbi Gubbi or Butchulla Aborigines were murdered in Maryborough. In 1861, 10 Waka Waka Aborigines were killed on Manumbar Station on the Burnett River. The next year, 1862, 7 members of the Bayabara tribe were massacred near the Caboolture River. And the same year, 25 Cubbi Cubbi were shot dead at Murdering Creek. It's sobering rehearsal of just a few. Now we know that some colonials set out with good intentions towards Australia's first peoples. I mentioned, I think in the little thing I wrote for the New Wave, Andrew Petrie and Governor George Gibbs in Sydney. But my perception is that mostly relationships soured and the Aborigines suffered under the more powerful colonials. Agents of the state, according to one bit of research, were involved in at least 50% of the massacres. So it's not surprising that a code of silence was developed very quickly around the massacres. Some researchers suggest that the numbers killed were probably much higher than any records show. The University of Newcastle research has uncovered so far 72 massacre sites in Queensland, about a quarter of the Australian ones, 2,032 Indigenous victims, 96 colonist victims. In the suggested liturgy for today, which I didn't include, there's a statement that's repeated several times. I think I've got it on the screen. Is it on the next? Yeah, this one. Layers of warning unfold in the stories not told. Layers of warning unfold in the stories not told. Now, when I try, poorly I think, to imagine what it was like and what it is like to be Aboriginal in Australia, I ask, what did the massacres do to the soul of the Aborigine? What does it mean that the majority white community took control of the remaining Indigenous population? What was it like to be removed from your own land or country? How devastated were they in having their children taken from them? How much were their lives governed by fear? What was the pressure to assimilate like? That Indigenous people should adopt white cultural ways, and that's always the pressure on the minority groups, wherever they are around the world. What is it like to know the threat of losing your culture altogether? Why did it take so long, almost 2 centuries, before Aborigines were entitled to vote? Layers of warning unfold in the stories not told. For me, it is a gift of grace when Indigenous people emerge as leaders in politics and in many other fields, and then work for the good of all Australians, in spite of their history of being abused. It can't be easy for Federal Government Minister Ken Wyatt, Minister for Indigenous Australians, to live in the largely white world of Parliament and try to be faithful to his Indigenous heritage and community. It's amazing that Sam Jones and his dad Ken are seeking to work with us for the good of the Noosa region. And Ken has started a food pantry on the Coolum Uniting Church property. Ken is also talking to our church council and the Sunrise Beach leaders about developing a bush tucker garden somewhere over this side of the church, near the building here. Sam himself is teaching Indigenous art, you're not surprised to hear this, in the prison system. He goes down to I'm not sure which prison, but it's down on the southwest side of Brisbane every week. It takes him a couple of hours to get there. But he's there, and their lives declare that they want to rise above their past history to serve the God who calls us together in love. So when we accept and tell the truth of the Aboriginal history in Australia, then we will appreciate far more the ways in which they seek to work in partnership with us. We need to try and understand what it's like for them, what their story means for them. We will be humbled by their efforts towards us. It would be a change for us to be humble when there's been so much arrogance on the part of white power. Truth-telling is a necessary step on the way to justice and reconciliation. So may God give us courage in a world of much fake truth to search out the reality of colonial and Aboriginal engagement in history. May we face the truth. This is not about trying to make us feel bad. It's about being honest. And may God lead us all into the truth of our Australian history. Amen.